What if a single ship was never meant to deliver cargo, but to test whether a system still reacts the same way as it did a year ago? Because in modern maritime conflict, the most important question is no longer what is on board. It is whether the response still behaves predictably. And on that day, nothing behaved the way old doctrine expected. Before we go further, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks naval power is only about ships and firepower. Because what happened next wasn't about either. It was about control of the gray space in between. Let's go. A cargo vessel entered the Gulf region. Declared civilian. Declared unarmed. Declared routine. But it did not behave like routine traffic. Radio calls went unanswered. Course corrections were ignored. And escalation warnings were met with silence. Not panic silence. Not confusion silence. But sustained non-compliance. 4 hours. 6 hours of continuous tracking. 6 hours of repeated identification attempts. 6 hours where every standard maritime protocol was fully activated and fully ignored. This is where naval analysts stop thinking in terms of captain behavior, because no civilian command structure operates like that. Under that kind of pressure, in that kind of environment, against that kind of surveillance density. If the ship is not responding, the ship is not the decision maker. Someone else is, and that is the moment the situation stops being maritime law and becomes strategic signaling, because in contested waters, a vessel is never just a vessel. It is a message, a probe, or a liability, and this one was all three at once. The ship identified in operational reporting as thus a continued moving deep break into monitored waters, while naval assets tightened containment geometry around it. Not rushing, not escalating, just compressing space. This is important, because modern naval enforcement does not chase anymore. It surrounds, and surrounding is a different kind of pressure. It removes exit options without firing a shot. For 6 hours, that pressure built, until finally, the boarding phase began. Fast insertion, controlled climb, no cinematic exchange, no exchange of fire, just procedural dominance. And what they found inside explained why no one on that ship ever negotiated a turn minus around. The cargo was not commercial inventory, not generic industrial supply, not Emma's declared oil or currency movement. It was a logistics snapshot of a supply chain under collapse. Specialized metal alloys used in high minus temperature propulsion systems. Precision minus grade electronic modules associated with guidance stabilization. Fuel line components designed for controlled combustion systems. Not assembled weapons, but the architecture required to rebuild them. And that distinction matters, because rebuilding capacity is harder than deploying it. You can replace a missile. You cannot replace the factory ecosystem that makes the missile repeatable. And that ecosystem had already been degraded, systematically, over time, across multiple strike cycles, which is why this shipment was not routine smuggling. It was continuity maintenance, the last attempt to keep a production logic alive. That was already losing its industrial base. Once that cargo was removed from circulation, it was not just interdiction. It was structural delay imposed on recovery. And that is a different category of impact entirely, because it does not stop a program. It slows its ability to return. Meanwhile, a second vessel was intercepted far outside the immediate theater, well beyond expected enforcement zones. A tanker linked to sanctioned logistics networks was boarded near the approaches toward Southeast Asian maritime corridors. This detail matters less for location, and more for implication, because distance used to equal safety in maritime enforcement. You left the choke point. You left the risk. That assumption no longer holds. And the message embedded in that boarding was simple. There is no operational far enough anymore. Only not detected yet. This forced a recalibration across the entire shadow shipping ecosystem. The so Midas called Ghost Fleet model. Agent hulls. Rotating ownership structures. Flag minus hopping registrations. Ship minus to minus ship transfers at sea. Identity laundering through paperwork chains. It all depended on one principle. That enforcement was local, not continuous. Once enforcement becomes continuous, the model stops being invisible logistics and becomes traceable exposure over time. And exposure over time is what kills it. Not one seizure, not one boarding, but the accumulation of uncertainty in every voyage. Because risk stops being theoretical. It becomes operational cost. Insurance rates adjust. Crews refuse assignments. Port access tightens. Financing disappears. And suddenly, the system does not need to be fully shut down. It just becomes economically irrational to continue. That is the deeper shift. Not interdiction, but viability collapse. And it feeds directly into the broader strategic pressure environment. Iran's external revenue flows have already been compressed through layered enforcement cycles, sanctions frameworks, maritime inspections, secondary compliance pressure. But what changed in this phase is speed. Not severity alone, but how quickly each layer activates, which removes adaptation time. And adaptation time is what keeps complex systems alive under stress. Without it, even partial disruption behaves like total disruption at the operational level. Inside Iran's strategic structure, that produces an internal contradiction, because the state still requires external inflow to maintain internal stability, while its external routes are increasingly non-linear and unpredictable. So every shipment becomes higher value and higher risk, until decisions stop being commercial and become existential. This is where behavior shifts, because when every movement is existential, risk tolerance stops following rational economic curves. It follows political necessity curves, which are far less stable and much harder to predict. Meanwhile, global markets did something unexpected again. They did not collapse into panic. They adjusted. Oil volatility spiked briefly, then stabilized into a higher baseline range. Shipping insurance recalibrated. Freight routes rebalanced dynamically. Not calm, not chaos, just fast normalization after disruption. And that is what makes the current phase different. Systems are no longer absorbing shocks slowly. They are absorbing them instantly, which reduces visible crisis, but increases structural tension, because pressure does not disappear. It redistributes into debt markets, insurance exposure, reserve planning, and long-term contract pricing, quiet accumulation instead of visible rupture. And quiet accumulation is harder to reverse. Inside Iran's internal political structure, that external pressure interacts with something even more fragile: coordination. Because when institutions lose control of timing, they begin to lose control of messaging. And when messaging splits, strategy splits. Civilian leadership signals negotiation necessity. Security institutions signal endurance necessity. Military-minded link structures prioritize deterrence posture preservation. And all three operate simultaneously, under shrinking economic runway, which produces contradictory signaling loops. Not confusion, but structural fragmentation under pressure. And in that environment, even small logistical events like a single cargo interdict should take on disproportionate strategic meaning, because they are no longer isolated incidents. They are indicators of system health, or system decay, depending on perspective. And that brings us back to the core shift. This is no longer about whether a shipment gets through. It is about whether any supply chain can maintain predictable continuity under persistent surveillance pressure. Because once predictability breaks, strategy stops being about control and becomes about reaction. And reaction is always more expensive than control. So the real story of that unarmed vessel was never about bravery, or confrontation, or even an interception. It was about what it revealed: a supply chain that can no longer assume safe passage, a maritime environment where distance no longer guarantees invisibility, and a strategic system where every movement is already part of a larger feedback loop. And once a system reaches that stage, the question is no longer what happens to individual ships. The question is, what happens when every actor realizes the ocean is no longer a space outside the system, but part of it? If you want the next layer of this story, stay with the series, because what comes next is not about cargo anymore. It is about how enforcement itself is changing the definition of movement at sea.